Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure. It's my pleasure.
What an absolute joy to have you here, because you have followed Paul all the way through, pretty much from day one, the beginning, that first single, right?
Yeah, I bought In the City the day it came out, I think. I've got it. I've still got my copy in my office here somewhere in the picture sleeve. Actually, I might have it behind me here. Hold on a sec. Well, look,
Well,
here's
there's
the
all
one.
the... Oh, yeah, yeah. Amazing.
Funeral Pyre. There you go.
Amazing.
That's when they start getting really good. I've got In the City back there somewhere. It's very beaten up. Yeah, but because I became a punk about, well, after seeing the Pistols on Bill Grundy when I was at home, and I thought, and I vaguely know what was going, because I used to read my brother's copy of The Enemy. But I was quite timid, so I hadn't gone out, and I was about 16, 15 then actually when it first happened, or 16. So I had never been to a gig, and it was a bit terrifying. So my first gig was X-Ray Specs at the Hope and Anchor in Islington. And then I vaguely knew, and I wound up going to the Roxy towards the end of the Roxy's days. Didn't see anyone particularly good there. It was quite a good night there, but I went twice, I think. I saw Sham 69 there the night they got signed by Mark P. But never got to see the Jam early on, partly because I think they'd gone off on a tour. They'd gone off on the big tour around the UK. I did see the Jam once. We hitchhiked, me and my friend, who was the only other punk in Leytonstone I knew. We hitchhiked down to Canterbury. So we were like 16, we went out and hitchhiked, which I suppose is quite good for kids, really, but people wouldn't let their kids do that now. My brother was at university down there, so we could stay overnight on his floor. And we saw the Jam there. So that was probably just before, that was probably, they only had the first album out. I don't know the second album out yet. And my friend, who was an idiot, who I've lost touch with, but he was an idiot. He went to a few of the early punk gigs, and I stopped going with him after a while. But he'd started spitting at gigs. Which for a brief period was a thing. And he spat. We got right near the front, and he spat, and he got Foxton in the face, which Paul would probably find quite amusing now. And Foxton leaned down furiously, understandably, and had thought it was me, I think, because he was staring at me like he wanted to beat me up. And I was sort of going, it wasn't me. I don't spit. Or this idiot next to me was pogoing on. So but I can't really remember the gig that much, because when you're a kid, you just go out and you drink too much, So I probably had 7 or 8 pints of lager that night. I remember it being really good. And I remember that moment of it very clearly. And I remember being a small theatre in Canterbury, so it was quite nice and close, But already I was going to see bands a little bit, because I'd got used to seeing bands in the Marquee or the Hope and Anchor or the Nashville, where it held about 200 to 300 people max, maybe only 100 in some like the Hope and Anchor. So I really like the intimacy of that and being caught up in it. I saw the Jam again on, I think, the Setting Suns tour. I saw them at the Rainbow Finsbury Park. But I was going off the Jam a bit by then, because their following had become slightly tribal and slightly stupid. So you had loads of kids following them who were singing to Eaton Rifles, but you knew they didn't really know what it meant. You just got that feeling. But I did enjoy the gig. It was a great gig as well. Never saw the Style Council live. I wish I had, because when Paul started the Style Council, I initially, like most people, mocked it, because suddenly they were wearing this sort of like Italian elegant clothing. But that was mainly because we'd come from that punk background where you mocked everything. You had to pretend everything was shit. Unless the enemy had told you it was okay. So I was caught up in that sort of idiocy. But I love the Style Council. I think I prefer the Style Council to the Jam. And I like that's probably my favourite period of Paul's career, but I do like lots of his solo stuff as well. And I love lots of the Jam stuff, so I still listen to the Jam regularly.
That's interesting, because I read that, I think this would have been then about the discovery of punk, and how that you said, like, the thrill of punk rock was something you never truly have recovered from. So it's interesting, and that was a real love of that, the music, the speed.
I think anyone who got involved in it early on feels that way, really, because I wasn't super early. I wasn't like that group, like the Artie Bromley contingent, or the people who were hanging out with the bands and then formed the bands. And I didn't go to Seditionaries or Sex. I did go to Seditionaries, but we went there hoping to shoplift some bondage trousers. And it was a day Chelsea or Fulham were playing at home, so they'd locked the shop up. So you went in there, unlocked it, and we thought, which I hadn't shoplifted ever before, but they were. I remember how much bondage trousers were. They were £35, so they were way out of our league, I wasn't into that sort of thing, but I think what it was that incredible sense of being them and us, you being versus the rest of the world, you being in this kind of very kind of somewhat iconoclastic group where you actually said everything that came before was shit. And of course, you didn't really mean that. And that's one of the things I liked about Weller and the Jam. I remember hearing a version they did, I think it was on the B-side or something. They did a version of Dancing in the Streets by Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, which I think they debuted at the Nashville when they played a gig there under the name John's Boys, which I wish I'd gone to. And they played the marquee as John's Boys as well, I think. But I really loved the fact, because I really loved Motown and soul music and R&B, you know, and I hadn't bought any stuff, but I'd been listening to a lot of it because I was, you know, when you're a kid, you're not really acquiring stuff yet. But I really loved that. So the fact that he was doing that, and then post-punk, I was wondering what to do as well, you know. And I wasn't a punk for that long really, because when it got too tribalist, and then the skinheads got involved as well, and it just around the time of that last gig I went to at the Roxy with Sham 69, when Sham 69 came and all that, it became sort of like, it became very unsophisticated, simple-minded. And previously punk had all these different areas where they were only really called punk by the media, and we called it punk as well because we wanted to be punks. But at the same time, you knew that the Buzzcocks were wildly different to Generation X, were wildly different to Wire, were wildly different and there were some bands that were sort of like bandwagon jumpers, you know, like Vibrators and 999 and people like that, who you could sort of tell weren't authentic. I saw the Police really early, and I like the Police, but I saw them supporting a band called the Radio Stars at the National, and we were just stood at the front pissing ourselves at Sting's high voice, you know, and calling him names, which I've told him since, and he hasn't thanked me for that. I think he endured quite a lot of that. So there was that interesting period when punk shifted, and it became the people who didn't really have what it took were still trying to churn out the same old shit, the same three chords nonsense, where the others went into slightly more interesting, challenging areas, Weller being one of them. And I always felt, he's never told me this, but I always felt that's one of the reasons why he wanted to cleave off from Bruce Foxton and what was the drummer's name?
Rick Buckler.
Rick, of course, who always seemed very nice, very harmless. I got the feeling that he kind of wanted to explore other things without it just being, you know, and you can tell that even from the second album onwards, when there's tracks like Tonight at Noon that are so clearly not in the punk mold, you know. And that second album was really a tremendous album. I thought it was one of their best, you know, but I don't know how it's regarded by other fans, but certainly for me, it felt very important because it felt to me like, oh, these guys are opening my eyes to other things. And you could tell there was the link there, that you could see that Weller had been reading beat poetry and was trying to do that sort of stuff. And then when I read an interview, mentioned that, so I sought some of that out and read some of that, you know, so there was that kind of growing up together that you got with bands that were smart. Whereas even though I love Generation X, you knew they were really, and they tried to do a Sub Springsteen quite thing on one of the albums, but they were always going to be sort of a disposable band. The same with, like, as I said, the Vibrators, a Sham. But when you saw a band like, you knew the Clash were going to try and stretch themselves, but also certainly interesting. And like, you look at what Lydon did with Public Image, which was an extraordinary leap that the Pistols probably wouldn't have been able to, or been comfortable making with him, you know. So when I saw people move that, and in a way, Weller's interesting because he did a lot of those movements while he stayed in the Jam. You know, he
starts adding horns or something. Yeah.
Like when I remember when Start came out, and even though we all know now there's a heavy Taxman riff in there, but Start seemed revolutionary. You know, Down in the Tube Station. You know, those sort of tracks felt really, well, they were genuinely original, but also interestingly had the same authentic voice and stance that the early Jam had, but it had matured and had become slightly more sophisticated and interesting. So I loved the way that, you know, he progressed like that. But I always got the feeling that he had, I mean, I don't know the full, I'm sure he's gone on record, but I don't know the full reasons. I don't think he's ever really clearly said 100%, but one imagines that's partly it. He wanted to move in other directions, and you must get tired of being tied to the same people. So I saw Weller then. The second one, so that was like when they played Eaton Wives, and I thought, I'm not really into this so much anymore, even though I was lucky to be there. And then I saw him a couple of times later on live. I never saw Style Council, so I wish I had, but I saw him at the what was it called? Town and Country 2, I think, the big one up near Islington, where he knew, and by then I'd met him a couple of times. He'd been on my show, and he invited me on stage singing all the Eaton Rifles, but I can't fucking remember the lyrics or anything. So I got on stage and I started saying a couple of lines, and he could see, I was saying next to him, he could see I didn't know the words. He went, fuck off. So I went off the stage again.
Well, we'll get into the solo years, because you went like really early on with the movement, the Paul Weller movement. Like when he was back, the Style Council had disbanded, had the record rejected. You went like before, like most people went, right? It was like really small crowds.
I mean, I still always listened to them, but they just weren't as dear to me, you know. So my fan relationship with the band would be, the Jam came out, I thought amazing, and I loved their sound. You know, because In the City is an amazing record. That amazing bass line, you know, such a great. And there was a lot of that playful kind of experimental stuff because there's lots of stuff at the Gravy in the beginning of Neat Neat Neat, really interesting kind of sonic experiments to get those 2.5, 3 minute songs in your head.
Mm.
You know, these great memorable things like that. And as I said, the first album was great as well, I thought, although I always thought the photographs on it were a bit shit. The second album as well, I didn't like the cover. They always struggle with their covers, the Jam, I thought. I don't think they had one good album cover that I really liked. I mean, I didn't mind In the City, but the second album, I didn't like the cover. Did you like the cover? With
the one under the
with the sellotape,
the West Way, when that's right.
Well, it's like, spend a day shopping, you know. So yeah, but I didn't give up on Weller. I didn't abandon something. I just felt like the Jam weren't a band because they'd struck me by then. They became almost not a kids band, but young kids in playgrounds really liked the Jam at that stage because they became so universal. And that isn't a negative thing necessarily because I loved Madness, and Madness were very much in that sort of mold. But when something becomes that mainstream and adopted by that many people, to go back to what you asked me about punk is, the thing about punk was you felt like you were doing, you almost felt like you were doing something artistic by being part of it, by recognizing it. You also felt like you were part of a kind of a clique, a clan, with your own rules and your own kind of like, you know, there was a certain amount of gatekeeping, but you knew what was good and you knew what was bad. So, and I started airing more towards trying to listen to stuff like, I really liked alternative TV. That Love Lies Imp single I really liked, you know, that kind of stuff was interesting. Whereas bands that were just flashy and going through the motions, if the adverts hadn't disbanded, you know, they'd have gone that way as well. You know what I mean? It was like, you wanted to see progression and you wanted to move on with them, you know, because of course you got older and they got older. So I did kind of bail out from being a hardcore Jam fan. And also it became a little bit naff, I thought, when you saw like loads of 13-year-olds going around with Parkers on. There's nothing wrong with that. I was pleased that they'd found some music, but as someone who was by then like 18, I didn't really want to be, it felt like...
There's a big difference at that age, isn't it?
It felt like childish fancy dress when you started in it. Whereas initially, I remember, you know, at one stage, really trying to get the correct Jam shoes and failing. Because I went to Shelley's and they had ones, but they only had the ones with the buckle, which I really didn't want the buckle. I wanted the lace up. Couldn't find the fucking lace up anyway. I had the buckle ones. But I had big feet as well. It wasn't a good look for me, the Jam shoe, because when you got a big bit of white on the front of a big foot, it just looks like you got clown shoes on. You know? But I went kind of the mod route as well. I liked the mod revival. I did like some of the mod bands, and I did briefly. I found a vintage John Stevens jacket in a charity shop, and I loved that. It was white with little pinstripe things and a big vents at the back, side vents. Until it got ruined when I left a ballpoint pen in the pocket and it leaked. Of course, the sad story. So briefly, I got into that, and I think I saw the Secret Affair live once, and they were fun. But once again, the audience were idiots, and I saw there was a band called The Pleasers, who were sort of, I imagine, old pub rock guys who did they were doing like fake Beatles. I don't know if you ever heard of The Pleasers.
No, I haven't.
The single was a version of a Who song, that one. You made me cry last night when you told me that you were leaving. Didn't realize, looking in your eyes, that you mean it. Oh, baby, don't go away. I think maybe it was an original by them in the Beatles style.
Right.
But they were fun live. But once again, you realize that was a sort of it was almost like a novelty act because they were sort of dressing like the Beatles. Whereas the Jam in the 60s, it hadn't felt that way, partly because of their youth as well. You know, seeing kids of that age wearing those suits and coming out with that energy in itself felt fresh. Whereas as soon as you see, like, you know, people who've been around a block a few times say, okay, this will be a good look. When it's contrived like that, I think your radar goes off. So I briefly was a mod for a while, and I liked that kind of stuff. The Merton Parkers I quite liked. The Lambrettas I quite liked. They were quite fun. But once again, they were all kind of very disposable. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
And that's why when he formed the Style Council, we were all a bit surprised. You know, when I say we, I mean the few people I spoke to about this kind of thing. Because seeing him with Mick, we thought, well, Mick seemed to come from such a lesser band. You know what I mean? It's like, what does Weller see in him? You know, and then when Speak Like a Child, their first single.
Yes, yeah.
And that came out, you thought, oh, that's what he sees in. Because it felt so fucking new, you know, it was amazing. So it was an exciting time to be listening to new records. Records came out that, you know, once again, some records sounded so different to each other, which today, to my older ears, they don't. They do sound fairly similar. A lot of them, you know, the pop all sounds very similar. The dance all sounds quite similar. Obviously, there are artists within that would contradict their statement, but it sounded so fresh. You know, something like that came out and said, wow. And that was just prior, I guess, or was it around the time of the New Romantics or
Yeah, it
before
would
or
have
after?
been. Yeah, it would have been. Which you really got into, right?
I was never a new romantic.
I think.
I must admit, I did have my hair puffed up in gel and I wore a diamond brooch for my passport, for my first passport photo, doing a bit of a Le Bon. But I wasn't interested much. I really like the clothes because I've always liked fashion and I've always liked weird clothes. I've always liked dressing in a way that people feel slightly uncomfortable about, So that I did like about it. But I was very into suits always, so I just wore zoot suits around that time and that kind of thing, or an approximation of a zoot suit that I could cobble together from charity shops. I never got a proper zoot suit made. But I love the mod look. The mod look doesn't suit me as much. So to be a really good looking mod, I think you shouldn't be too tall and you certainly shouldn't be too fat.
Mm.
Uh, so right now I'm too fat. But back then I was too tall, really. And I always thought mods looked better when they were smaller and neater. And I never liked the mod haircut. I mean, there's an interview I did with Weller in the 90s on that 3 times a week show I did in Channel 4, where he performed Tin Soldier and something
Yes.
else, I think, as well. He's got the worst fucking haircut. He's got the same haircut Jim Carrey has in Dumb and Dumber. I never knew why the mods went with such a kind of unforgiving fringe. And that's one of the things why I really liked about Style Council. Finally, I thought, oh, he looks good because he looked really handsome. Then you realize actually he's a really handsome guy. But the mod days you didn't ever see that much.
Mm.
And you look back now and you see that John Lydon was a handsome guy when he was young with that slim, great cheekbones. But at the time, because it was all like anger and aggression, they were not evaluated in that way, which is probably a good thing. So I was never into that style particularly. I do love the Style Council style now, but at the time I didn't quite get into it because I think I was trying to be slightly more Middle European David Bowie Kraftwerk futurist. So a lot of black overcoats, carrying around having a copy of the Communist Manifesto or Ishtar by Lenin under one arm and an obscure jazz album on the other arm. I used to walk around carrying Ornette Coleman quite a lot. The interest about Weller is I've always been aware of him just as someone who appreciates, artistry and people, is that he's always struck me as being authentic. He's always, even when sometimes it rubbed against the grain, like when he came out and I think he said something pro-Thatcher or pro-conservative early in the punk days, which was, of course, was the worst thing you say. And now, even now, people are idiotic about politics. It's like you're either left or right. And if you're left, then the right is scum. And if you're right, the left are idiots, or communists. And it's childish nonsense. And even at the time, I kind of appreciated him saying that. I thought that's a really interesting to say because you're, in a way, regardless of what you mean by it, you're opening the door to people saying, oh, actually, maybe I don't have to just have the same views as everyone else.
Mm.
I can maybe look at it and think about what I wanted, what I think is right, whereas previously it was very much a kind of doctrine. But I really admired him for that. It struck me as being quite a bold thing. I don't know whether, I think it was something that bit him on the arse a bit, but certainly, because it's interesting at the same time, he was always there. Well, he was always one of the first. Later, of course, he was, I think, one of the founding members of Red Wedge.
Yeah, him and Billy Bragg, right?
So there was a kind of a contradictory statement. Maybe he just said it to be contradictory, but either way, I liked that he said it. I admired him for saying that. And I very much admired the swerve they took to Style Council, even though I didn't get it at first, because I thought, okay, this is really interesting that, and obviously it was useful to him, I think, to try and cut off that kind of more Slavish adoration that came with the Jam.
Well, it was getting rid of all the people gobbing. That's what it was.
Yeah. Well, they'd stopped gobbing by then. Gobbing only lasted for about 3 months, I think, just long enough to give Joe Strummer hepatitis C. That's how long it lasted. Poor old Joe. He did. He got Hep C from people spitting at him because the Clash used to get a shitload of spit on them. It was awful.
That's
It was fucking disgusting. And I don't know why it started out. I think Sid Vicious apparently started, they reckon, but I don't know.
So, but presumably you weren't somebody who was, when the Jam split and when Weller called it a day then, you weren't somebody who was like absolutely gutted about it that
I
point
was
then.
actually quite pleased. Part of me wanted to hear more Jam music, and part of me still does. Because when they were good, they were amazing. And even when they weren't good, they were sort of amazing. I mean, and I liked the fact that they were, the interesting about the Jammies though, I felt like they were heading, at their best, they would have headed into the kind of more whimsical areas that bands like the Small Faces did. They would have gone off into their version of Odd Guns Nut Gone Flake or some of the early Faces material. And there was elements of that on some of the recordings already, the playfulness. Like I remember there's one where I don't know if it's Well or Fox, he's going eggs, 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 poached, fried, or boiled. They go for your old bit, something like that. And that is very much the sort of thing you'd have got from a 60s band who are suddenly relaxed in the studio and thinking, oh no, we can do what we want. There aren't any rules. and it would have been interesting where they'd gone with that kind of. They would have gone. I think they'd have gone into like some sort of folksy rock and some sort of like more R&B traditional rock, and you'd have seen more experimentation. But you know, we already had that from the Faces and the Stones and all those bands that had come before them. And I think, you know, Weller going off into, I don't know what genre you call Style Council. It was sort of, it was called cafe something for, wasn't it? Or
Well, yeah, and I think it went all over because it started off, it was jazz, and then it was all kinds of things on Our Favorite Shop, and then soul, and even classical when we get to the Confessions
Our
album.
Favorite Shop is a great album. It's an underrated album, I think. But still, the Style Council's first album is my favorite of the albums, I think, which is often the case with Weller. I think, you know, he does this kind of, and he's done, you know, there's always good stuff on his albums, but you'll get one that seems, you know, really perfect. So no, but I wasn't overly upset the Jam had split. You know, it struck me as being, but it was interesting because they, in a way, it felt very, in a way, I was pleased because there was still an element of me that had that core, that the reason why punk was so attractive was that bands had got too big and were out of touch with their fans. And I never felt like that, out of touch with their fans, but they felt somewhat other to you. They felt like they were living a totally different life.
Hmm.
And by the time the Jam got that big, they felt like they'd become one of those bands, you know. And so to restart and start small again, and of course it's much more exciting to have a new sound. You know, what I wanted was, you know, to have more of the same is fine, but to have something new is much better.
Hmm.
You know, and I still love that now, even people I love. And it's one of the reasons I'm sure why Bowie, even though it must have been fucking exhausting for him, but to come back, to stay tuned to what was going on and come back with his version of new sounds and new technology was what gave him that incredible career and that incredible longevity and incredible connection with people, you know. So we always liked him, even if it wasn't the same him as before.
Yes.
You know, and that's I think what was interesting about Well, and that's what he achieved with the Style Council, and then with Stanley Road and other stuff after that, and Wildwood. You know, when he went into those directions where it became okay, it's still you, but it's a different you. You know, it's you now.
And that fact you don't know what you're going to get. And I want to ask you about Bowie actually, because I remember, you know, one of the things for me, Saturday morning Radio 2, listening to you was just an absolute joy every
Oh,
single
thank
week.
you.
I still miss that show, man. It's a
Thank you.
fabulous, fabulous listen. And so I want to ask you about some of the connections with Weller on the TV and the radio. But as you mentioned Bowie, let me ask you about that, because you know every week you play Bowie, you're clearly like a massive super fan, and it's, what is it, 8 years since Bowie sadly passed.
Can you hang on one sec? So sorry. Yeah.
No, go on then.
We're going to set off an alarm in a minute. Do you want
Oh,
to hang
right.
on?
Yeah,
Go
go on.
ahead. It's not working.
I was thinking about this and you being such a massive super fan of Bowie. I remember that. And what is it? Well, like, so when you know when your artist, your guy passes, and you're not getting new music from him, how are you feeling about that? Because I guess I'm asking, do I need to prepare myself for this report? I can't imagine what it'd be like, because Paul's so prolific and Bowie was as well, that you're constantly getting new stuff, and then suddenly that's gone.
I didn't. I never framed it that way. I never thought, oh, that means no more Bowie music. I suppose I did think about it. I just felt very sad he was dead. It seemed too young to die, which it was by today's standards.
Mm.
Having said that, you can't be fucking greedy. You know what I mean? It's like if they've given you that much, and you know that sense of disappointment you have when every artist makes a misstep in your eyes. You know, it's all subjective. I went to see Bowie on the Glass Spider tour, and I walked out halfway through. It was so bad. I very rarely walked out on gigs. I walked out on Bowie. And even then I was a massive fan because it was terrible. It was fucking terrible. So the flip side of looking at it is, well, at least he died before he did another Glass Spider.
Yeah.
I don't think he would have done another Glass Spider because I think that was fueled by there were difficult circumstances. And I think anyway that he was back on substances, etc. back then. And it was just and it was like him copying himself almost. It was a really weird one. I don't know if you saw it.
No.
You can see there's a they've shot the live concert in Australia and you're watching, it's just fucking wrong. You know, it's just awful. It's like a joke version of somebody who doesn't understand Bowie trying to do a Bowie show. So I never thought in that way, really. I mean, there isn't always an interest, but then having said that, you know, there are some things, but just like I really like a lot of what's on Black Star, that last album that was released just 3 days before he died, I think. But none of that would be my favorite.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So, and there is a feeling where, you know, music's such a fascinating thing because a lot of what you love about it, is to do with where you were at that time. So when I listen to something new now by an artist that I've just recently got into, for example, I started listening to quite a lot of Argent recently, and I
Okay.
really like that kind of like prog rocky 70s stuff, which I hated when I was young. Partly because I just didn't get it, partly because I wasn't exposed to it, and partly also because punks weren't allowed to like that, so I wouldn't have listened to it. But there's stuff you can discover, but it's never going to be hardwired into your system as much as the stuff you discovered when you were 16, 17, when the whole world was for you. And you didn't have any responsibilities, and you were out there, and all you were thinking about was music, and then to a lesser extent, girls if you're straight, boys if you're not, drinking, clothes, but music being that big chunk of what you are. And it isn't now. It is a big chunk of what I am in a totally different way. It's a big chunk of what I am almost nostalgically. And so everything new that comes out, like, I'll always buy the new albums by the old acts when they come out. And Weller's different because Weller is actually always doing something interesting. But for example, like I bought the new Madness album. I bought the new Boomtown Rats album. And it's hard to tell whether it's good or bad in a way, but I know it isn't as good as the earlier stuff. But it might be that it doesn't feel as good because I'm not as excited about it.
Yeah, you
We've
don't.
got
Yeah,
so much more of everything now, you know. So I never thought that way about Bowie. I mean, it is a shame he couldn't produce more, but at the same time, you know, I went to see his Lazarus show and I found it massively tedious. So, you know, there were lots of things he was doing that he loved that I wouldn't have appreciated or wanted anyway. My main feeling was, you know, well, it's difficult for me, Bowie, because I knew him a little bit towards the end. So it is like I wouldn't have said he was a friend because I didn't know him that well. But you know, he was an acquaintance who I would sometimes touch base with. So there was a different feeling with it, and it had evolved into something else. You know, in the same way, if Weller died, because I have memories of talking with Weller quite a lot, not a hell of a lot, but occasionally. I think I would. My initial feeling would be sad that that human has gone, rather than that producer of content which I've enjoyed. You know.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you about, so one of the really early, in fact, I think maybe the first performance of Paul as a solo artist on TV was on your show, Tonight with Jonathan Ross, 1991, and this was the Paul Weller movement. So this was that right at that beginning, but. And he did like an interview where he talked about mod. I don't know if you can remember this. It's kind of in Weller circles. This has become quite a famous thing. The kind of "bury me a mod" thing. Do you remember this?
I do not. I
He had
remember
this
talking
wonderful
about Live
sharp
Aid.
haircut.
I talked to him about Live Aid about
Yes,
that.
you did. Yeah.
See, I don't like looking back at my early interviews because I'm so fucking inept in them. But you can remind me. So what did he say about? He said he would always be a mod.
Well, he talks about the fact it was like a religion, a mod being a code, and you asked him, you know, are you still a mod? And he said, yeah, I'll always be a mod. Bury me a mod was the quote. They'll
But
bury
you
me a
know, I
mod.
can see that in his work in his life. It's not, you know, and it's not just as superficial as fashion, although he's always had that. He's always looked amazing. But it's also that because when you talk about style counts, of course, the original mods, the early British modernists, were into poetry and literature. They would be reading Colin Wilson and is it Alistair Milne? No, what's his name? That guy, the poet.
Oh,
There was the
no.
poet that Weller referenced once or twice, and they were into jazz, as well as they were into ska, as well as they were into American R&B, Tamla Motown, Stax, all that stuff. So it didn't ever feel contradictory, and I can understand that. When the only other person I know who seems as devoted to modernism as well is Martin Freeman,
Hmm.
you know, who is obviously an avid. You can see that even though he isn't like a mod, like he doesn't ride a Parker, sorry, he doesn't ride a Vespa or a Lambretta, but you can see the way he has his haircut. He's still got a fringe like that, and he's still got
The
sharp
sharp,
fitting,
lines.
hairy
Yeah.
suits always, and so it is a kind of code like that, you know. And I can see why, but I mean, and once again, it comes back to this thing as what you're hardwired as, what you find as a kid, because you're looking when you're young, you're looking for who you're trying to find out who you are, and you're also trying to create who you are, you know. And so you have to find something that works for both those things, something you think is you, and something you're happy pretending to be, you know. And for me, that was punk actually, you know. So I had no connection to the '60s in that way, you know. So that's why still I would wear ridiculous trousers. But still, my punk style, my dress style is sort of when I'm off camera is sort of not today. I'm wearing a Taylor Swift t-shirt because I went to see her with my daughters last night, but and it was an amazing gig.
Yeah, it looks phenomenal.
Too long, but amazing gig. But I think you are hardwired somewhat, and I think maybe you know I don't know whether it was John a big sort of like R&B mod type guy, John Paul's dad?
Not really. No, not really. I don't think. I don't know where. I think it just came from him flicking through a magazine and liking the look of it, and
It
back to the
did look
style, the
amazing.
fashion,
It
right?
looked
Yeah.
better. It certainly looked better than the hippie period. I never understood. I can appreciate it. I look at the later period Stones, or I look at the Faces, or I look at Jimi Hendrix, and I appreciate it looks fun, but I'd never want to dress like that particularly. Whereas when I look at early Small Faces or early The Kinks and all those photographs, they look fucking amazing. So I
Mm.
can see why. And when you listen to those early singles, I mean, if we're talking about influences, those first three or four Kink singles are extraordinary. The early Small Faces stuff is extraordinary, right up to and probably beyond Itchy Park, where once again you see a growth and a change. Extraordinary music, really amazing music.
Mm.
So, and that, a lot of that Northern Soul stuff and the kind of more interesting R&B stuff, fabulous, as well as just the Motown. So I can see why you would warm to that. And once again, some of it quite subversive as well in its way once you understand what they're doing and what they're saying. But I'm glad that and he certainly is, because now he does look like he's still got that mod look, but he does look like someone. It's really weird because he now looks. He's sort of like Ronnie Wood Jr. He's got that sort of vibe still. So it's still in the same school. I mean, Weller looks better than Ronnie Wood. Obviously, he looks young, well, of course, but that hair, and the
Mm.
fact that he's got the long silver hair now is kind of amazing. Best time I ever saw him once. I saw him once. I didn't say hello because I didn't know him very well. I think I'd interviewed him once. I was getting my car filled with petrol on the Finchley Road, and there was a bloke in front of me getting his car filled with petrol. And when he got out, I realized it was Weller. Now, here's the difference between this: is I was in my family car, the only one we had, which was like, I think, a Toyota Previa, grey, beaten up, a bit shitty. He was in what I think was his family car, which was a very black, stylish looking one, like a Mercedes or something, with a surfboard on top. And he came out of the car to fill up wearing a beret. And I think years later, I said, I saw you once driving around. I said, you had a surfboard. Did you ever surf? And he said, I'm pretty sure he said, no, but it looked really good on the car. So it was a mod adornment.
I think that was on Radio 2. You rang him on his 60th birthday.
Yeah, that's when this is after my fall from grace with radio via Saxgate, but I was back standing in for someone. I think I was back standing in for
Might be
Steve
Steve
Wright.
Wright, maybe. Yeah.
And I knew it was his birthday, and it struck me. It struck me a few times over the years how important that period was, but in a way how dismissed it still was. I went out for dinner with John Lydon a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to him about things a bit like this. And you think, actually, what he did with the Pistols and what Weller did with the General, that it was such radical change. But because it was a kind of cry of youthful age as well, it was dismissed by mainstream media very much. And I suppose to an extent, there's always that. If you look at when the Beatles first came out, people would talk about this long-haired, yeah, yeah, yeah music, or the Rolling Stones were seen as a joke. But then when you look back, you think, okay, no, they're pivotal points in the way pop culture, modern pop culture changed. And the same can absolutely be said in a very, very, very clear way about early punk and those bands. And yet, in a way, they've never been embraced quite as much in the way that some of the 60s stars were. And partly, I think, because they didn't play the same game. They didn't become cozy media figures. And they didn't go off and live, like Weller and Lydon, certainly, they didn't go off and shag models and swan around Monaco as tax exiles, and so there was and in a weird sort of way that kind of hasn't worked against them, but because they didn't follow what was the presupposed trajectory for them, I think we forget, or people do forget about the impact they had, and it isn't just old Jam fans who are aware of Weller's incredible gift to us. I think it is what was the media, and so I wanted in that, I thought, well, here I am in a very mainstream position right now. Maybe I can show him some of that mainstream love. And so that's why I phoned him. I said, do you know what you mean to people? I don't think you know quite how much you mean to people. And I think he was genuinely really pleased to get that call,
Mm.
as opposed to normally when I interview him, I always get the feeling he's not very comfortable being interviewed. I don't think. He doesn't relish it. He was meant to be on my last series of the talk show because he had that new album out.
Yeah.
And we had him confirmed. Then he said, and he pulled, he said, I don't feel ready to perform it yet. I'm not comfortable enough in the material to perform it yet. So it's a shame. So we couldn't have him on, but I was looking forward to it. And I would always have him on if he's got new stuff, so there's always a space for him. But there is that sort of like thing, I think, where his stuff has meant so much to so many people, but in a way, it sent so much in different ways to different people. Because he isn't people like the Rolling Stones, they talk about the whole Rolling Stones back catalogue. But if you talk about, and once again, I'm comparing to Lydon, that you probably won't thank me for, but if you think about Lydon's impact, people think about Public Image, which wasn't anywhere near as mainstream or popular, and the Sex Pistols, but you think about them as very much two separate things. When you think about Weller, you think about, in a way, you think about three phases. You think about his later stuff, you think about Style Counts, you think about Jam, and they didn't always cross over with the same fan base. Whereas if he'd been with the Jam all along, I think there's that feeling like, you know, this band, this guy has been here forever. And of course, he has been working for that whole period. But when you think of Jagger, people think of Jagger, the Rolling Stones. And in a way, that adds to the appeal or adds to the affection, because it's like you've been getting the same thing, different versions of it, for such a long period of time. You know,
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that in that way. You're right. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in that way. That's very true. Well, actually, in one of the, would it have been after lockdown? So yeah, one of the most recent Paul Weller appearances on TV, apart from Jules Holland, would have been on your show as well. So this would have been, what was the album, Fat Pop Time? So he did Shades of Blue.
Yeah, which I really like. Fat Pop. I think it's a great album. Was he with his daughter when he
That's
came?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think she'd helped him write the song.
Yeah.
I remember talking to him a little bit before and during the show about the kind of alchemy of songwriting. I don't know if it was in the show or not, 'cause of course we had it. And Leah was there with him, who was very lovely. And I think she'd helped him with some of that, because I think he had been stuck with some moments there. And it is an incredible thing. And you think, here's someone, I think those of us who don't do it, we're so used to just receiving the final product that you kind of assume it was always going to be that way. But then you realize something like that, which is That's Entertainment, which is such a radical song for the time, amazing song. Morrissey used to cover that as well, do a very good version of it. But something like that, and you think, well, they probably went through several different chord moments in it, several little bits. Well, let's go up instead of down, let's go sideways here, let's change the voice here, maybe that word doesn't work there. But of course, that is now it forever. But it is fascinating. I love talking to people like Weller about those choices they make at given times, and how they know it's ready, or how they know it's finished, or how they know when to walk away from it. You know, and Fat Pop, I thought Fat Pop was a really good album. Did you like Fat Pop?
Yeah, that was great, because it was all like back to that, what you were talking about earlier, the kind of 3 minute songs again, wasn't it?
Yeah, which is kind of what we like. But you know, he's never done a concept album, has he?
No, well, Setting Suns was meant to be, wasn't it? I think you got like 3 or 4 songs in and then kind of abandoned that idea. But no, hasn't.
I like a good concept album. Obviously, Quadrophenia being the one we all like. But have you ever heard SF Sorrow by the Pretty Things?
No, I haven't. I will look that up.
Listen, it sounds a bit shonky to modern ears, but it's interesting. It's one of the albums that really inspired Bowie in that period.
Let me ask you about Saturday Zoo. So this was a show which I have 2 memories of Saturday Zoo, right? You obviously have many more, but I have 2 memories of Saturday Zoo. One is Weller, which we'll talk about. The other was you and Chris Evans singing a Queen song with no clothes on.
Right. Okay. So let's deal with me and Chris first. So Chris was the new up and coming star. And I liked Chris. I'd worked with Chris briefly. He'd been a producer on a radio show I'd done for an attempt by Virgin to start a network radio station, linking together lots of independents. And he came down from Manchester, I think he was in at the time, started working with me. He was a prickly, he was a weird guy. He's always been a weird guy, but clearly a very talented guy. And we worked on that. And then he suddenly became really big. I think Big Breakfast was still, I don't think he'd done Don't Forget Your Toothbrush yet, but Big Breakfast. And I was obviously quite threatened by him, because I'd had that first burst of like, I was the new young face, which I hadn't really understood or exploited in any way. It just was happening. And I was frankly terrified for most of the time I did The Last Resort, but it was still interesting. It was exciting, of course. And he came along, but I liked him, you know, I knew him, and I said, oh, would you come on my show? And you know, really was to sort of like make sure that we still fresh. And that was something he used to do, this nude guitar thing. He used to do as a live thing, bizarrely, with the guy who he was working with on the local London radio station at the time, Andy Davis.
Well, I used to listen to that on GLR, yeah.
Yeah, and it was a fun, weird show. And I'd been on it once. They'd come round and surprised me live on the show. My wife was furious, because they came out and said, we're going to see if you'll come in the studio now. Some weird shit. So I drove in the studio and left her alone on a Saturday afternoon. She was pissed off on it, quite rightly. That was when Chris exposed himself to me. And I remember describing it as looking like a fetal mouse on a bed of radicchio. As a joke in the show. I didn't feel threatening. I'm not making a claim here. I'm not trying to Me Too Chris Evans. And so he came and did that. And I went to his house and said, I want to do it. And I was always trying to I always felt like TV should be, certainly early in my career, you should, even if it doesn't work, try and do something different, you know. So Saturday Zoo was very much a failed experiment, really. I remember when we did the pilot for Saturday Zoo, we did the pilot. I went to the woman who was the head of entertainment at Channel 4 at the time. And I said, and we weren't very pleased with the because I knew what I wanted to be, but I didn't have the confidence to try and do it myself. And so I don't know whether it would have been any more successful, but I was relying on others, and there were things that I can't do. Like I'm not very good at script writing, and I wanted him to do that. And so the idea I think was quite solid and fun. But in a way, the flaw of my idea of Saturdays was it didn't need a host, you know. And so, but it was a show for me. So like I'd created something which was never going to work in a way. We did the pilot on it, and she said that was, I've got to be honest with you, the worst pilot I've ever seen in my life. I went, right, so we're not getting a series. She went, well, I'm giving you a series because I haven't got anything else. She said, so we started in a sort of fatalistic way. And we did a lot of things on that are really good fun. I don't think any of it works that clearly, but it was on Saturday Zoo that I had the idea to get Chris Walken to read Three Little Pigs,
Yeah.
which still circulates. It was the first time anyone had done that with him. And then lots of other people have done
Well,
the
there
same.
were people like Mark Thomas, and I know David Quantick, who's been on the
Yeah, Mark
podcast,
Thomas
was
in
involved.
it.
Yeah.
We had some great stuff in it. We had Coogan doing Paul Calf and Pauline Calf. We had John Thompson and Simon Day doing, and some of the skits were hit and miss. We had me and Roland River on trying to do a comedy sketch thing that didn't really work, but it was quite a good idea. We had that quiz. Oh no, the quiz show was not on that. The quiz show was on 1 hour with John Foss. I did Knock Down Ginger. Did you ever see that?
Not that I remember.
I did a show Sunday night live from 9 till 10 called 1 hour with Jonathan Ross. The first term was me trying to do like fucking debatey chat. God knows why. Awful. The middle bit was a quiz show I came up called Knock Down Ginger. You know where you knock on a door and run away? And so I built a set. I've gotten build a set which was 3 rows of actual full-size doors in the studio on a platform, and people stand around. When you knock to, and we've got 2 people out the audience to do the quiz live, and it's like, okay, and they knock on door number 3, and it might be just a sign, like a traffic sign, and we'd ask a question about that, a funny question, or it'd be Vic or Bob or Paul Whitehouse and Charlie Higson pretend to be characters, or we had what's his name, the drummer from Genesis, In the Air Tonight, Phil Collins.
So, all right.
Collins was behind one, just the postman one day with a big sack of mail. And I remember we had some weird guests. It was a really interesting example of something of its time. We had like Gilbert and George on one week as guests, and we ended the show with me, Gilbert and George, Vic and Bob dancing around a side of beef that Bob was pretending to be a butcher, him dancing to Bend It by Dave. Was it Dave D. Dozy, Mick and Titch? Bend It. Yeah.
They don't make television like that anymore, Jonathan.
I know, I don't think they do, and maybe they never should have. But
there is that.
we certainly didn't find an audience with it. I remember once driving down because there was one show that kind of had most of them had some good moments in and some bad moments in. I remember driving home feeling slightly dispirited about it, and actually taking some consolation from, it was a warm, as I said, it was a live show, so it's Sunday at 10, I'm driving home, and the sun had only just gone down, but it was very warm in the West End, and I had to drive from the South Bank. I drive through Trafalgar Square up to North London, and I remember seeing so many people on the streets. I remember thinking, good, none of them saw it. But Weller came on 1 hour, Saturdays, and he did Magic Bus, I think, didn't he?
Yeah, he did, yeah, Bull Rush into Magic Bus. He did Malice, and you got up and sang with him.
Oh, there's no stopping me. Shameless. Malice was great, though. Malice was a great track.
I remember you saying on that show, because I've watched it as part of prep again for this, and you saying about like grown men crying everywhere watching him do that again. Because
to see him do an old jam song, it is interesting. There's a certain resonance to it, isn't there? You know, because he'd shied away from doing any jam stuff for a long while, which is understandable. But that must be quite difficult for an artist like him, with stuff that, and we know he was obviously the primary creative force in the jam, but to have something which really is yours, but because you did it with other people, you feel you can't own it anymore. You know, so I felt pleased to see him retake ownership of that early stuff. You know, I mean, I'd love to see him do some other early stuff. Not so much early. You know, I don't particularly need to see him do In the City ever again or anything like that. But certainly, it'd be nice to see him like Tonight at Noon, which I thought was a lovely song. You know,
he's done like English Rose and things like that as
English
acoustic.
Rose is such a beautiful song. Yeah. With that great riff. Once again, you can see his influences there. You can see that sort of like McCartney-Lennon influence coming through there. More McCartney than Lennon on English Rose, I thought. But no, that was good. I don't remember anything about the interview, but I remember being quite exciting that we had Weller on, certainly. And it's interesting because there was a sort of slight changing of the guard taking place, even though I wasn't aware of it at the time, where by then I'd been on TV for like 5 or 6 years. And TV once again was still a very different landscape to what it is now, because we didn't have, I think Sky had just started, but it wasn't a success in any way. They didn't have any shows on apart from The Simpsons and some sport that people wanted to see. So really, there were still only the 4 channels. you know, and it was like it was very different, and there was a real reluctance to change on one. I mean, when you think about it, I think they were still showing black and white minstrels up in about 85 or so, 86. You know what I mean? It's like,
Jesus.
it's absurd when you think about it. And the BBC was still a kind of bastion of this sort of like older school stuff. And I was sort of in a way, I was like a mediator between the old and the new, because I would always have the older guests on, which I always liked,
Yeah.
but I would champion the new. And having him on like that, it felt like, oh, actually now, in a way, he is a star guest. It's not us saying he's a punk band, you know, when punk first came out and it was like, oh, what's this new thing? It's like, oh, no, no, you're an established creative force now, you know, and you've got a following, and you've got, and then I remember realizing a few times I spoke to various people to try and get the Clash back together to do something on the show, because you realize, but then hold on, they meant enough to people who are now old enough for them to be the main audience,
Mm, mm,
as opposed to you weren't trying to get a band back together that people say, who the fuck are they anyway, you know?
yeah. That's interesting when you say that, though, because I wonder if there's I don't know, you and Paul might have talked about this, but I wonder if, I assume there would be a gratitude to you for Paul, from Paul, of that kind of period whereby, you know, those early performances, for, you know, the press, from his point of view, the press's point of view, rather, he was washed up, he was done, the Style Council's finished, his career's over, and actually, you know, he's getting you know, a prime time kind of vehicle with you, having you on, because when we get to, what would it be, 22 Dreams, Wake Up the Nation, Sonic Kicks, he's on every time he's got an album, he's on your show.
Yeah, well, I mean, partly that's because I'm a fan, but partly also because I know there are lots of other fans out there. And by
Mm.
the time we get to those tracks you're talking about there, you know, obviously his solo career had established itself. And I don't know, when would you consider that his solo career became solid? Was it about the time of Stanley Road?
Yeah, so Wild would have been relatively
Oldwood.
successful, and I guess he was back on top, but Stanley Road was the biggest album of his career, actually, over 2 million albums sold, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, so Wildwood was great. I remember doing something, you probably might find it. I went in, I did a thing called Here Come the Brits or something. Um, and I went and went and spoke to some of the people who were nominated. I think he was nominated for Wildwood, I think. And we went to Abbey Road and he performed it in a little city.
Wow, what?
So that's out there somewhere. That was on ITV, I think. Um, I spent some of that because I was very proud. I lost a lot of weight. Some of that I dressed as Aladdin Sane. I just had body paint on. A very odd show. Not when I was with Wello, I hasten to add.
Yeah, just turned up. But there's a bit, I mean, it feels like there's two things I want to ask before we go. So one, you as an interviewer are always somebody who clearly you prep the arse out of these things, and you know what you want to talk about, but actually you're great at this. Is not me blowing smoke up your arse, Jonathan, but you're great at following the story and where it takes you, and having a conversation, which is what this is all about, right?
Well, it's
Whereas,
interesting because I don't know how prepped I was. I used to prep quite a bit, but it was quite hard to prep back in the early days of my career because before the internet.
yeah, right, yeah,
When I started on TV, it was before the internet, which was interesting. So when you wanted to do it, especially an older style, but not so much, but well to an extent, if you wanted to look at old enemy articles, you had to pay a firm, a cuttings firm, and they kept all copies of all old newspapers, and they would go through it, and they would have itemized. They would have an inventory of Weller, or Jam, or Clash, or whatever, and they would get the inventory. And you could either pay for the big pack, the small pack, or the medium pack, depending on how much information. And they would send you bad photocopies of these old articles. You had to read them, and of course, articles are, you know, newspapers generally a very unreliable source of what people have actually said, you know, because they deliberately sometimes misreport, they change context, they take things out of proportion and deliberately. So I would have been there, but I think, I think I became a better interviewer after I started doing the radio shows. When I was doing the radio show, I relaxed into just trying to think, okay, what is someone listening who knows just enough about them? What do they want to know? Rather than me saying, famously in 1974, you said to Marcel
yeah.
Duchamp, and it's like, the fuck are you talking about? You know, any question where you have to explain the question is a bad question. So I got more relaxed generally. But I to go back to what you said, I don't think. I mean, it's interesting. It's a name I should mention here is quite important. This is when I first set up my company, which was Channel X, I set it up with a guy called Alan Mark. Now, Alan Mark still runs Channel X, and Alan Mark was working in all those early shows you're talking about, not the BBC period onwards. I was split from them by then, but right up until Saturday Zoo, I was with Alan Mark, and on that 3 nights a week show. And Alan was a mad Jam fan. Alan had been sort of not really a punk, had been just into the music because of the Jam. Alan knew Crowley, he knew Paolo, he knew all those guys who were part of the evolution of Weller's career and who were close to Weller. And he had travelled even on a bus with Crowley and some other thing. They'd gone on a bus over to see the Jam in France very early in their career.
Okay, right.
A mad, drunken, mod fucking bus party went over. And so there would have been two people in the company who really wanted Weller on, me and Alan Mark. Um, and Weller vaguely knows Alan as well, I think, because he knew he was an early fan. And Alan's a very nice man. He still makes good TV shows. He made The Detectorists with his company.
Oh gosh, right. Wow.
And so there were two of us there. And but because of the reason why I'm saying that is, so there was never a feeling. There would never have been discussion of saying, should we have this guy on? He's not as hot as he was. We were two people who said, fuck, Weller said yes. Amazing. You know, so because we'd never changed our view of him. You know, so I don't think there was ever a period. So I would hope he didn't feel the need to feel gratitude, because we always just felt grateful that he was coming on.
Yeah.
We were genuinely always very excited he was coming on. It always felt to me. And in a way, when someone's off the boil a bit in terms of what is seen as some sort of like, cultural consensus, when they're off the boil a bit, that's often a much more interesting time to have them on, because
Yes.
they're normally a little bit more open. They're sort of normally more, and they're more an interesting phase in their career, Whereas when you get someone on who's just riding on and had hit single after single, especially these days, nowadays everyone's so media trained. But back then it was often, they were harder to get to, but it was less fruitful. Whereas sometimes when people are actually being forced to reevaluate or forced to work out what they want to do next, that's a much more interesting time to have access to them, And we've always, the interesting about over the years, I've had shows where you think talk shows rely on the guests, which to an extent they do, of course, you can't do without them, but you'll have a show where you have one really big guest on, and you'll be surprised because often the figures are exactly the same as the week before when you had no one particularly exciting on in terms of what the press thinks exciting.
Yeah.
But if you can make a good enough show, it doesn't seem to matter, So we wouldn't have ever looked at him in that way. We wouldn't have thought, oh, he hasn't been in the charts for a while, or he's not getting this kind of buzz. We would never have taken into account. We were just like, who do we want on the show?
But the thing is, as well, with that relationship you have with all your guests, but with you don't often see, and I know you mentioned the fact he's kind of an uncomfortable interviewee, but you don't often see Paul being funny, and he is funny. Everybody said this to me.
He's got very dry wit. What you have to do is, and you'll see that I don't manage this in the early interviews, is you have to give him a little bit of time.
Yeah.
After the question to say what he's going to say. And in that first one you mentioned, which I did look back a little bit, that one in 91, you can see I talk over him quite a lot because I'm desperately trying to make the show work and not trusting the guest, And that's one thing I learned to do, is that a little bit of silence isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if you give him time, yeah, he's funny, he's dry, he's personable.
Well, and later on, you're able to you're taking the piss out of his haircut, and you're talking. I mean, I've never heard and talking about homeschooling, these kind of things, which actually is because he's not seen as, he's not in his head, he's not a celebrity in that way.
Yeah,
he's just an ordinary guy who happens to make music. But you that kind of relationship you have and the conversation you have, because it's not fixed agenda. You're going wherever the conversation takes you. You get those things out of him.
Hopefully, he knows that I admire his work, and so that's always the bedrock it's coming from. So if there's someone whose work I don't admire and you start having to go about their haircut, even in a jokey way, it's a bit like, well, what the fuck are you? Yeah. Why are you doing this? But I think it's like, and until I wouldn't say we were friends, because I really don't know Paul, but I spoke to his wife fairly recently because she was trying to find something good for him for his birthday, and she asked me if I had any recommendations. And I was trying to hook him up with a really good I've got this really beautiful old Grundig radio sound system thing from the 60s that looks amazing, but we couldn't find one in time. But he so I wouldn't consider him a friend, not that I wouldn't want him to be a friend, but I just say I couldn't claim that because I don't really know him that well. But certainly I would hope that he would feel relaxed enough with me because he knows that I'm coming from a position, and in some ways as well, I think he knows we've had similar lives in that I come from a very, not well off working class background, growing up in East London, and very much, not a Rishi Sunak one, not like I was deprived from Sky TV, but we didn't have a car, we rented our TV. There were sometimes we didn't have food in the house, we never had holidays. So I come from a similar background, and I like to think also I'm not someone who acts particularly differently now to when I wasn't on television, and I think that's true of him as well. So and we've had kids and we've grown up in that way. So well, you have gone through things. I mean, it is always fascinating when you go out. I remember having dinner with Bowie one night. We were invited around some guy's house and Bowie was having dinner there. That's why they invited us, because David said, oh, we invite a few other people. And most of the conversation in the end was actually quite dull because we were talking about how you choose what school to put your kids into. And I didn't really get that involved in it because I basically never really thought about it that much. I just assumed you send them to the nearest school, like what happened to me. Whereas my wife had gone to this nice school and she went, "Oh, maybe," and it's like, and so you wouldn't think that would be the case.
Yeah.
But that's the conversation. The conversation is, fuck me, this kid's doing this and this kid, what do we do about this? Just parents talking.
Yeah.
You know?
This has been such a joy. I have two final questions for you. So one, you're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be the Jam, the Style Council, or solo. What would you go with, Jonathan?
It would be something from the Style Council. The thing is, I hate this sort of question because I don't want just one track. That's why I've never, well, one of the many reasons I've never done Desert Island Discs. Apart from that, they always try and make you fucking cry. I've never done because I don't want to choose favorites, But I love Ever Changing Moods. What are the? Tell me some of the other Style Council tracks. So
Shout to the Top, Long Hot Summer.
Long Hot Summer is amazing. A Long Hot Summer. The only thing is, I would be depressed if I could only listen to that forever. It would remind me of when it first came out, and I would want to listen to more stuff. So, but I would probably go. My favorite period of his career probably is Style Council, just because I like all the sounds around it. You know what I mean? I mean, I like the look as well. Pictures of him. Although Mick never looked comfortable in that gig because Mick's got a bit of a kind of a snouty face, whereas Paul looked like he could be in a cafe in Italy, whereas Mick always looked like he'd been dropped in from fucking Deptford or somewhere. But I love the sound, the way they were produced, and the sound with the brass and with the kind of jazzy overtones and sometimes the piano up front, and sometimes quite sparse, but in a very tuneful way. But I mean, maybe I'll choose one from each period then. So Jam, I'd go with that. No, I'd go with Start. And then, yeah, I think I'll go with Start. I mean, I could go with about a dozen for the Jam. Then Style Council, I'll go with maybe Ever Changing Moods. And then solo period later on. Oh, I don't know. I might go Wildwood is so good, you know. But don't make me do this.
All right, well, I won't. Now, part of this project is, as you know, so it was a podcast. I got to interview Paul last year, but at Paul's suggestion, he said, turn this into an oral history, turn it into a biography, rather. It's going to be a big oral history book. And I get to interview Paul again at the end of this year as a kind of, master in this art, Jonathan. What would you like to know? Is there anything you'd like to know about Mr. Weller or from Mr. Weller for that?
I'd like very specific information about when he first decided to leave the Jam, to split up the Jam, who he spoke to about it first, obviously his dad, how he couched it to the others, what he's driving, what it was that he couldn't bear to be in the band anymore, specifically, please. I'd like to know whether or not he had any vague idea of what he was going to do next, whether he had the germ of the Style Council in his head, had he already cooked it up with Mick, was he ready to go, well, he didn't, of course, it wasn't straight away, but did he know he wanted to go more in that direction? It's weird. I remember talking to I think it was Woody Woodmansey about Bowie, and obviously Bowie was Bowie, but for a while they thought they thought they were a proper unit.
Right, yeah.
And Bowie told him that the band were broken up via a message that was sent to him on his wedding day. So Woody has every reason to be pissed off. But no, I'm fascinated from that period because I don't think there's any question. I'm not intrusive about him. I'd quite like to know what he really loves listening to more than anything else. And I imagine it's probably a combination. We all know probably it's like Small Faces and early Tamla Motown and Stax. But I'm quite interested in all that. I'd also be interested to know whether or not he actually still rocks a beret when getting petrol. Ask him if he only put the beret on because he knew he was going to a petrol station. Was it that level of stylish affectation?
Man, this has been such a joy. Thank you so much, honestly.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it too.